Yeah, I'm Chris Schmitz. Like he said, I work remotely for a company, a tech company headquartered out in San Francisco, and I'm recovering from a stint as a manager and getting back into more of the technical leadership path. And one of the big kind of areas of emphasis as I've been doing that has been testing with our team and upgrading our kind of test tooling and patterns and conventions and switching from I won't go into this a whole lot, but we were using some different tools like Enzyme and Mocha, and transitioning from that to Jest and React testing library. And I'm excited to share some of the things we've been talking about here. All right, so first, I don't want to assume any knowledge about testing here. I know, especially with the mixed group with Wisconsin UX. So I want to go high level, just explain, really what are we talking about here in terms of a test. It's very different from the kind of A/B testing we were just looking at, and kind of the motivations for why I feel that testing is really important. And testing can actually be a pretty polarizing topic. You might talk to people who you'll talk about automated testing and like writing tests for your code, and they may be adamantly against the idea of even doing this. But so all of this is my perspective and how I think it's provided value to me and the teams I've been on. We'll talk about the different levels of tests that you can write, some of the tools for writing tests, and then finally, I've got a handful of tests that I'm going to go through using CodeSandbox. So these are like an interactive online editor, and I'll have all these examples that I can actually share afterwards too, if anyone wants to go back later and play around in the CodeSandboxes with some of the, and have all the like React and the testing tools set up too. So starting with just a definition, make sure we have some shared idea and terminology of what this really is. The way I think about a test is just code that we write to verify the behavior of our application. Sorry, there we go. I guess another way that I think about what is a test, I think about it as we probably all are familiar with kind of click testing, going through and like manually testing, logging into production, verifying, clicking through the behavior of the thing that I just pushed to production, and making sure that it works as I expected. Some teams have just really big QA teams. They don't have any automated tests, and they rely totally on that. But this approach is more, from my experience, relying on the engineers writing the feature code, writing automated tests that I think of as kind of like an army of like little robots that will, run all these repeatable tasks that you could ask a QA team to do. But then anytime anyone pushes any code to production, we run all of these, thousands of tests to verify that everything is working the way it's supposed to. There are no regressions in the existing code, and the new code that we added is working as expected. So jumping into the why of why I think it's important to write tests. This is a very Googleable topic, and you'll find different reasons all over the place. But there's a few things that really stand out to me, like things that have really provided me a lot of value around like a good test suite. The first one is I feel like tests serve as documentation of how our code is actually supposed to work. I've been on teams that have tried to document things in every way imaginable, but in my opinion, the closer to the code that the documentation lives, the better, and the more likely it's not going to get out of date and become stale. And if your documentation is yelling at you because you broke it, like it's incorrect, it's just guaranteed that you're going to go and update that. So I think stepping into a new code base or ramping up someone on our team. And I think people tend to look at the tests as documentation. You look at the source code, and there could be any number of like bugs or use cases you might have overlooked, but then you look in the tests and you see, oh, it's actually an assertion that this behaves this specific way. So this is a feature, not actually an oversight or a bug. Another big benefit here, I think, is consistency. And we're going to talk today about a specific, testing React components. I think about them as more almost kind of like integration type style tests, but there's all kinds of different levels of testing, like we'll talk about. But I think some of the most valuable tests that I've seen verify that people do things consistently. That you name your files a certain way, and your directory structure is a certain way, and there's a whole set of linting tools, and there's static analysis, and all those are really providing the same. I think of those as tests because they're providing the same value. They're telling me when I'm doing something. They're providing me feedback about my code that I can act on and actually like go from red to green to make things pass. And anytime I'm like pushing code to production, I feel like a good test suite just gives me so much more confidence. I mean, I really do feel like it's just a nice warm blanket, nice, very comforting to have this while I'm working in a code base, because if without it, I constantly feel like, I don't know, it really feels like the Wild West to me. So maybe I know that this is a little bit because I've transitioned from thinking, well, I mean, my progression is kind of like, I don't know what testing is. I became aware of testing. I'm like, why would anyone do that? It seems like a lot of work. To like, okay, fine, enough smart people seem to be doing it. John keeps telling me that it's important. All right, I'll write tests. And then to the point now where it really is a crutch for me. Like I need to have the tests there to really be confident about the code that I'm pushing to production. And I think for anyone new coming into a code base, if you have a complex system, it's really nerve-wracking to get those first commits out into production, and having a strong test suite can really help people feel a lot more comfortable navigating a code base, especially when they're not familiar with. But ultimately, I think all this just boils down to productivity. We write tests because we think it's going to make the team more productive, and that accounts for code quality and all of that over time. And there's definitely trade-offs here. So if you're a solo developer, cranking out like an MVP code that you plan to throw away in 6 months, like maybe there isn't value to get tests around that. But if you think you're laying the foundation of a multi-million-dollar business and you want to onboard dozens of developers to help you maintain that code base in the future, like those tests are going to be the foundation of something much bigger and provide a ton of value, provide huge dividends going forward. So I mentioned briefly that there's different types of tests, starting kind of at the highest level and working our way down. There's end-to-end testing, which is almost like a QA person, but it's spinning up actual web servers, databases, inserting records in the database, and pulling data out, going through, literally simulating someone using a mouse and clicking a keyboard. That's what I think of when I think about end-to-end testing. Integration testing is testing where you still have multiple units or modules that you're testing, but it's not, you don't have to stand up the whole stack to do that. So you might be rendering a React component, you might be simulating user behavior, but we're not actually starting a browser, or we're not making real HTTP requests, we're not hitting a database, anything like that. And then there's unit tests, which are for testing kind of a single function. In our case, we're talking about React components. I think you can, like some React, if you're not doing any sort of user interaction, simulating any events or anything like that, you could make the argument that testing that something renders is maybe a little bit more like a unit test. I don't care to really have that argument, but I think this is much more kind of smaller single units of code that don't have many kind of other modules that they depend on or are interacting with. And then finally, static, and I think of this as like the static analysis that I mentioned earlier. So think about TypeScript, Flow, ESLint, those type of things that provide you immediate feedback while you're writing the code. All right, so I mentioned, I've mentioned this a couple times now, but we're going to be focusing on React tests, React component tests, and I think of these as integration tests. I think of most of what we're going to do here using React testing library as integration tests, but just kind of fair warning, go around, you'll hear some people call them unit tests and other things too. So getting into what is the most basic JavaScript test we can even think about here. This is really all the core of a test is. We have an expectation that a value is going to be something. We're going to run some code, and that something should be this value should equal something, and we should get an error if that's not the case. So thinking about with just vanilla JavaScript, what's the most basic thing we can do? This is about as close as you can get. But you'll notice, this really isn't very helpful in figuring out what is the actual issue here. I mean, we have some information, that true is not false. We have a stack trace here, but it's kind of hard to parse this and understand, what's really the issue here. And this is where one of the first tools that we'll look at here is going to provide a lot of value. So the focus here is going to be on React testing library, but there's this kind of framework called Jest, which is actually a few tools. Jest is a test runner, an assertion library, and also some utilities for mocking. So it's kind of hard. I want to differentiate those because they actually are. If you look at other tool chains, like I mentioned Mocha earlier, that's a test runner, and then we use chai to make assertions, and then we use sign-on to do mocking. So Jest is kind of all those things in one. But a test runner is helpful in this case because it can give us a kind of DSL, like a domain-specific language for writing tests, and then giving us more helpful output to actually identify where the issues are in our code. So looking at Jest, this is the exact same test, but you can see a couple things here. So this test keyword, this is part of the Jest runner. The runner is going to look at a bunch of files, grab all the places where it sees this test keyword, and it's going to execute everything inside of here. Once we get inside of this, the kind of callback or the function that we pass to the test, this is actually the Jest assertion library. So it gives us these methods to say, expect this thing to be this other value. And Jest has all kinds of kind of more helpful methods, like when we get to testing DOM objects, there's things like to have attribute, to have class, all kinds. You can extend this language to whatever you want it to be. But I just want to call out that this is the kind of test runner portion of this, and this is the assertion library at work here. And then looking at the output of a Jest test, this is, at least in my opinion, a little bit more helpful output to look at. It points to the exact assertion that failed, gives us the visual of the test, it makes it very clear what the expected and received values were, and just gives us some nice formatting. If you have a whole suite here, you'd see a bunch of green alongside the red here, and that's where you can start to think about too. This is a description of the test. I mentioned that these often serve as documentation. If you think about describing the functionality of a module, you can maybe see how this formatting in here and how those descriptions of the tests start to read like documentation. So that's kind of the tools and some background on what the different levels of testing, why I think it's important, what a test even is. I'm going to jump into some coding, like live coding, just writing some tests. But does anyone have any questions on any ground we've covered so far? All right. Cool. So like I mentioned before, I'll share these out later too, so you can jump into these and play around with these if you want to. I have in these examples kind of the starter here where I'm going to try to like fill in the blanks, writing the tests. But I also have this this finish test.txx in all of these. So if you want to see kind of the the final output or whatever, if anyone comes to these later, and also maybe in case if I get stuck, I can reference that.
Chris, I have one perhaps leading question that could be helpful for people who are newer to testing.
Yeah.
Just in the way that you might think about what you need to do in order to test a given piece of functionality. Is it good practice to have one test, so like a human would, they'd have to create an account, then they'd have to log in, then they'd have to click this, they'd have to click that to verify some behavior. So you can think of that as like one action building upon another action, building upon another action until you get to an expected result. Is it a good practice to have tests that need a lot of setup for each other, or is it better to have each test kind of be able to run independently, or do you ever run just one test at a time? Do you run the full suite? Maybe a little bit of your best practice in that regard might be helpful as we dig into the first couple ones that we're going to write. Yeah,
for sure. All these examples are very trivialized from what you might see in a production app. The feedback loop in these tests is going to be almost instantaneous. Definitely not the case at work for me today. I would say thinking about you definitely want to minimize the dependencies on your tests. You want to be able to run them. I think ultimately you want a tight feedback loop, like I said. And the more dependencies you have to set up a test and get into the place where you can actually test the logic you care about, the more expensive that is, the slower your tests are going to be, and the longer that feedback loop is. But again, thinking about like an end-to-end test, there's no way you can. It's going to take some time, to insert records into Postgres and start a Rails server and all that stuff. So there is no way around some of that. But sorry, I feel like I'm rambling and not answering your question. No.
I guess just in general, right? You should be able to. Each test should know what it needs to spin up in order to execute in isolation. So you shouldn't have to start the test suite all the time. Certain one or a certain file, or from the first.
Oh yes.
The first test, right? So you want to write each test in a way that it can independently verify its own correctness.
Yeah.
It might still have to do a whole bunch of work, but
right.
Each one that's somewhat similar but a different permutation of what you're trying to test would want to be set up to do that same work from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. And most of the testing tools that we have, like we don't even execute our tests in the same order because we want to watch out for the possibility that someone wrote a test and they almost like didn't tear down the data correctly, and there's some like leftover state, and that actually makes the next test pass, and you get a false positive. So yeah, you definitely, like John said, John told me to write tests, and now I write tests. No, thanks for calling that out. I'd love to like get into maybe some conversation more about some of those general testing best practices too later on. But yeah, so thinking about can everyone see the font, the code and everything okay? Decent size? Okay. Thinking about how can we test a React component. The first thing we need to do is we just need to render it. So thinking about how we render a React component in anywhere using React DOM, the first thing we're going to need is an element, just an HTML element. We'll create a div, and then we're going to say React DOM render. I have this app component. Sorry, I'll explain what that is in a second here. And this is we'll verify that this is doing what I think it is here, but this is actually going to, we now have a React app rendered inside of a kind of a virtual DOM. So Jest uses something called JS DOM, which is like a simulated browser environment that has all the APIs. So you can call like document, and then it has the method create element, and you can create divs and things that look like and behave like all the normal DOM, or like gives you all those DOM APIs. But sorry, before I get into this, I want to show what we're actually testing. This is an example from the React documentation. They, in talking about one of the principles, they have this kind of demo application. It's just a little to-do app. So yeah, need to create my slides for this presentation. And there's no like checking things off or anything like that. It's just showing, you know, how you can kind of set state within the app and render things. Ultimately, it's just a form to create an item, and then this list rendering the items and managing some state here for the app. So what we want to test right away, in this test, all I care about is that let's get the component rendering, and let's just make sure that we can make some level of assertions on this. So since we have all the DOM APIs at our disposal, we can use things like query selector here, and I know that there's an H1 on the page, and we can say, so we're verifying that there's an H1 on the page with text content of to-dos. So I'm trying to verify that this is actually being rendered. And this CodeSandbox thing, it has an integration with Jest. That's what we're looking at here. So I have it enabled that every time I update a file, it's going to automatically run the tests, and we'll get a kind of a feedback loop here on the right side. If I update this assertion so that it fails, we can see, you know, like that example I showed before about with the Jest output. There's an example failure. And then let's also expect that we are going to have a label for the input. And it's going to be what needs to be done. Thank you. And you can see it's highlighting, it's a little janky, but it's trying to highlight where the test failed. So just another example of like tightening the feedback loop on your tests. I just want to call this out because it's like there's a lot of stuff I'm not going to talk about today that actually can be really nice for developer productivity, and like this like automated test running and then like feedback in the editor. Like I don't even need to, I mean, think about I'm writing without this panel open in my editor. I'm getting feedback just like with ESLint or like a TypeScript error, like, hey, you're not fulfilling the requirements for this test in real time. And then the final thing here is I'm going to look for a button, and that should have add number 1. All right, and all of our tests are passing. So all we did here was render the component, make sure that there's an H1, a label, and this button here. And then moving on to another example here, like this works. This is like better than what we had before. We are doing a lot. Like we are rendering a React app in the DOM and making assertions, but this is all still kind of clunky. You know, actually using like the browser APIs, it's kind of inconvenient. It's also really easy to get a false positive. I could write a really bad test here. You know, I just changed. I added a typo here in this for attribute, and if you look in the browser, you know, normally when I click the title, it would highlight, or it would focus the text box, and a lot of screen readers rely on this type of functionality to be able for people to navigate pages, because the input doesn't mean much to someone with a screen reader. They can see that it has an ID, and maybe they can infer a little bit from that, but they have no idea what to put in this text box if I break this. So I'm going to leave that broken. And this is where I want to reach for the first tool from kind of the testing library toolkit. So the testing library is kind of the namespace that a whole bunch of tools live underneath. The first thing that they wrote was the React testing library, but from that they realized that there's a whole bunch of things here that are not specific to React. Like, we need at some level we need to just traverse the DOM and be able to get different elements in a nice way, verify that labels and inputs are connected correctly, things like that. And they've encapsulated all of those into something called the DOM testing library. And we're going to work our way up towards the React testing library, but I think it's important to show, rather than jumping there, we'll kind of see what each individual tool does and work our way up to the bigger abstraction. So this has something called get queries for element. And here, we're using this, we can pass in any sort of selector, like a CSS selector, to this query selector. But like I mentioned, that allows us to do a lot of kind of hacky things. But when you think about how a user uses an app, they don't go looking for an H1. They don't go looking for a label. They don't go looking for a button element. They look for the text, what needs to be done. They look for the text, to-dos to understand, like, I'm on my to-do list. So these tools also really try to encourage thinking about testing from the user's perspective. I mentioned some tools like Enzyme that we were using before, and it made it really easy to assert things like, this prop is this value on a React component, or the state inside this component is a certain thing. But that's actually, you could kind of think of that as a code smell to test internals of the component like that, when really all you're, I think it's more helpful to think about it as just from the user's perspective. I see this input and I'm gonna, and think about just in terms of like simulating their events, and ultimately all that matters is what is rendered in the DOM. So that's all we have access to. So we are gonna use this get queries for element on our root, and then rather than doing querying the element and then using text content, we are going to query the text, and we're going to use a method called get by text and get by label text. So this is now and let's just comment these out and make sure we still have a passing test. Okay, so get by text works. That is still present on the page. That's still what we care about. I'll get to that in a second. Sorry. Again, we're going to do get by. In this case, we're going to use this method called get by label text, and this is just another example of React testing library kind of encouraging us to, not only is this just finding the label, but it's validating the contract that label and the input have together. So you can actually see, oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. We actually see we get a much more helpful error message here now. So we found a label with the text, but there's no form control associated with it. So now that has uncovered this issue that went unnoticed with our kind of naive, just like using the DOM APIs. So that fixes that issue. And then let's get by text again. All right, and now our tests are passing again. We have a little cleaner API. It reads a little bit nicer too, rather than root.query it. I don't even remember what the method was that I used, query selector or whatever. Get by text, get by label text. They're very relatively descriptive, and it's pretty clear what they're doing. But you can see there's a lot of repetition here with like expect not to be null. And really, these are all going to throw an error if they fail anyway. So I often just, don't even put the assertion around them. I had a typo here as an example just to show this is going to fail for you, so you don't actually need to put an expectation around them. And I mean, there's different styles for writing these, but on our team we've decided not to, because really this is the finder, but also the assertion for us. So decent refactoring from where we were to here. And working our way up a little further, let's take a look at React testing library for the first time here. So you can see there's a bunch of setup code here just to even get to the point where we can make assertions. And you can see this is something we're going to need to do for almost every test. So we'd probably think about abstracting this. Let's put this up here. And then let's pass in our component. So our tests are passing again. And this is a little bit nicer. It's much easier to focus on the real meat of this test. And it's still relatively easy to see kind of what all the different pieces are doing here. But this is where React testing library comes in. And all it really is this, or the main thing that people use it for is, it gives us this render method for us already, and some facilities for, there's a lot more that it does, but the thing that you use for literally every test is this render method, which returns that get queries by element, which will give you all these helpers kind of in the context of that React application you just rendered. So again, just going from this to refactoring with React testing library. We also don't need this. Haven't used for React DOM anymore either. Any questions so far on anything that we've gone through?
Is there a frequency that you recommend testing?
Frequency?
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're going to make updates to your app. You want to run through your tests, but just once your app's ongoing in production, do you run them on a cycle?
Oh yeah, every piece of code that someone wants to push out into production, we create a change request saying, hey, I want to merge this code into production. And it has to, a few things have to happen in order for them to be able to do that. Another engineer has to review the code, and you use a tool called GitHub, and it'll show a diff of hey, they deleted this line, they added this line, and it gives you a nice UI for commenting on the code and asking for changes and approving or denying. But then also GitHub has all these checks that you can tie into. So we actually run our entire test suite. So it takes, I think we have 40 computers that we spin up for each test run that we parallelize it over, and it takes 20 minutes. So it takes hours and hours to go through this whole test suite, and we do that on every time anyone pushes any code that they want to get into production. So we lean on it, we run it, all the time, every day. When I'm working in locally, I never run the whole thing just because it takes so long. But I always am running the individual file that I'm looking at or the individual test. And I'll set up either like this, we have it automatically running the relevant tests, or I have in my editor, just some key bindings and stuff to say run this test quick to get it. Because I think really, yeah, at the end of the day, I keep talking about that feedback loop, and I think the tighter you can get that, the more valuable they are. Yeah, of course. All right, well, let's get into something a little bit more fun. Simulating user interaction. So rendering the content, we're pretty good there. It's we've got our React app rendering. We abstracted away with the DOM testing library, another abstraction on top of that, React testing library. And now let's tap into another tool from React testing library where we can simulate user interaction. So we're going to use something called Fire Event for that. The first thing we're going to do is render our app again. And then in order to simulate like a change or typing into an input, the first thing we need to do is we need the element that we're going to interact with. So we can use one of these queries. Let's say we're going to get by label text, and like the syntax highlighting is off here, I know. So what needs to be done? So this is going to give us our input, and then we're going to use fire event. There's a change method. We pass the input, the element that we want to simulate the event on, and then some information about the event. And this syntax is a little bit wonky here, but I'll mention another tool to kind of make this provide a little bit better kind of helper for this too. I think it's target and then the value. And let's say we want, what did we say? We needed to do the React testing library presentation slides. And then we want to fire another event to click. The button. And then we want to assert that the React testing library presentation slides is present on the page. And let's also assert that there's some logic in this to change add number 1 to add number 2. So let's assert that that's there as well. That updates correctly. Cool. So our tests are passing, and we've just with like relatively little code, we're simulating user events, and we're testing React components that actually handle user interaction. And, the way that it's amazing. I mentioned like Enzyme before. Really one of the big motivations we moved away from that was, we might get something like the, this would just return like a wrapper element, and you'd always be working with this object called the wrapper, and you would often you can access the state of it like wrapper.state, and you might test that the to-do items are equal, like you can make an expectation on this now that it's like an array of the things that we just added. And this just encouraged a bunch of bad testing habits that we just got rid of a whole class of issues once we kind of moved away from that tool to React testing library. It just doesn't even give you the option to access internals of your components like that, which we found really refreshing. I did mention there actually is a little easier way to simulate events here. Oops. And I'm using this CodeSandbox thing. Again, they have a nice UI for like adding an additional dependency. I added this user event library here, another thing from React testing library, or from the testing library folks. I'm probably gonna get this wrong. I thought I could, I don't know if I have types for it, but I think you can do, I really shouldn't try to do this on the fly because I'm forgetting the syntax, but just know that this user event testing library exists and it makes some of the interaction stuff a little less painful. I think I linked to it on one of the slides with some additional resources at the end. Gotcha. Yeah, I didn't know if using TypeScript, if I had to install some types for it before I would get, yeah. So in this case, I think the big thing is simulating input. So like click isn't as helpful, but when you think about typing, like sending a change event to an input element it's just like all the text at once, versus in this case, you can simulate like each keystroke with this API right here. So if you really want to, it's a little bit nicer syntax, but also a little bit more realistic user input as well. So I'll just leave it at a mention there. And the final one I want to talk about here is testing async code. So it's often the case that, you know, to do anything meaningful in a test, you know, you're interacting with the server, or there's something happening outside of the component that you need to interact with. And Jest gives us some facilities for mocking, like I mentioned. So we've seen the test runner, we've seen the assertion library, and this is an example of using the mocking API. So normally you can actually do just jest.mock, and you can pass it a module. This is kind of a unique, like, powerful thing about Jest. This will like mock everything on that namespace or everything in that module that you import. Because of CodeSandboxes like integration with Jest, for some reason that doesn't work. But so this is kind of a workaround, but it provides the exact same API inside of our tests. So I'm importing from this API module, which is now being used. There's one change in the application code here. Rather than just doing set items, you know, I'm actually making an API call to create this item. I'm posting it to this endpoint, and here's the new object that I'm sending there. And then we get back the persisted item, and then we put that into state in the React component. So normally, you know, we never want to hit an actual server in our tests or anything like that. We also just don't even have like a HTTP request environment. Like we would get an error if we actually tried to make a real HTTP request out of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to mock that entire module. And like I said, normally this would already be a mock, but in this case, I'm using this like jest.fn, which gives us like a mock function that we can make assertions on. So mock create item. The first thing we need to do is say what we want this mock to return when it gets hit. Let's see, mock resolved value once. And we want to return something that looks like one of these to-do items. And I can see you all see the?
Yeah.
Weird, okay. I can see we're gonna use this a lot, so I'm just gonna, pull this out to a variable. So this code is also needs to execute asynchronously now. So by default, you know, it's not going to know that it needs to wait for this asynchronous code to run. It's just going to try to render the app. It's going to click add, and then we're looking for the test, and it's going to for this text, and it's going to fail because that is running this asynchronous action before, and that needs to finish and resolve before this text is going to update. So we now need to make this code async so we can use await. And with React testing library, there's all sorts of these kind of get by helpers. There's equivalents for all these that will take a promise that start with find, and you can await those. And another way to write this code is there's actually a wait method that we can import from React testing library, and that will get us back to passing. So now we sit with a couple lines of code here. You know, we mocked out the HTTP request and we simulated. We were able to get this test passing. So this is also kind of a side note, like a benefit of abstracting away some of your, like if you have an API library, putting it out into its own module so that you can do things like in your tests here, you can mock out the entire module really easily. You could also think about setting up some kind of default resolved values with like fixture data or something to make some of the setup code a little bit easier. But yeah, finally, the one thing, anytime you mock something, you want to avoid kind of any sort of false positive. And I think it's nice to kind of make an assertion that the mock was actually hit. So I will say to have been called one time. And then we can also let's see, to have been called with, so we can assert that it was hit with the correct value. And not always relevant, but important to call out that, you know, a lot of times you won't care necessarily about what's happening with this data, but you know that it's going to kind of send some data outside of the component, and you want to assert that it sent it in the right format. So we know that we're hitting the, I think it was the items path, and this is kind of a little jest helper that they give you rather than defining the whole object with the ID, because the ID is just the current time, and we could like mock out date.now and control that ourselves, but rather than do that, I'm just going to say I only care about one attribute on this. So, and then I want to make sure it's called with to-do text. And that's passing again. So with we've covered about 90% of the API that I use in writing like most of my tests and like our app. These are definitely simplified versions, but hopefully understanding some of those kind of the building blocks of React testing library helps you kind of feel, understand what's going on under the hood, and hopefully help kind of, it's been helpful to me to understand things that way when I need to like debug things and really understand when something's going wrong. And yeah, I've got a couple things here I'll share out, but I know we're getting late here. I bet my computer's going to die. So a couple more resources here. I mentioned that I've got the CodeSandboxes here. Here's that event simulation that I mentioned. We didn't talk about hooks at all, but React testing library has a specific React hooks testing library for testing hooks too. If you're thinking about running accessibility tests, this is something we were starting to use. It'll analyze a component and say like, hey, you're missing the ARIA label attribute on something where it's supposed to be, and you can specify like, I want to be compliant with these different standards, and it'll do all that for you. But yeah, that's all I got. Open any questions or additional conversation, but thank you so much for your time, and yeah, sorry it got so late.